جيشكم عليه مش حيقدر لي ما بتقدر على قلبي مش حتقدر لي.
All right, shall we start?
جيشك فيك قلبي.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Samir with JVP-LA, and FYI, we are recording today's event. So if anyone is uncomfortable with that, please take the necessary precautions, change your name, turn off your video, whatever you like to do. I'm really happy to see a lot of familiar faces out there, and even happier to see some unfamiliar faces. And anyways, if you'd like to be a part of the JVP-LA mailing list, please find the sign up link in the chat. Also, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat as well, and please type where you are zooming in from. It's pretty cool to see people from all over the country and now many parts of the world. So I'll start. Although it looks like I'm in Bethlehem, I'm really in LA. And speaking of where we're from, I'm going to pass it over to my comrade Karen for a land acknowledgement.
Good morning, everyone. It's essential because of the work we do that we remember whose land we move on and reside. We can't fight against one pillar of oppression, Israeli occupation and apartheid rule over the Palestinian people, while ignoring the other pillars of oppression, in particular, the violence that the indigenous to this land have experienced and continue to experience. As Jewish Voice for Peace in Los Angeles, we honor the Gabrieleño Tongva, Kich, Fernandeño Tataviam, and Ventureño Chumash peoples who have been the land's stewards, modeling a tradition of resistance and seeking liberation. And now back to you, Samir.
Thank you very much. I'm looking around and I see people from as far as San Diego. Actually, that's not very far. But over here on the West Coast, people from Oakland and Portland. And I see some friends here from as far out there as Cape Cod. Really cool. London, Ontario. And of course, I see our speakers from Lebanon. And we're going to get some more. I see some of our co-sponsors from Rogue Valley and Portland. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for showing up. Let's see. Before we start, I have a few quick announcements. Shout out to our co-sponsors. Please, here's the list right there. And one of our co-sponsors, JVP Central Ohio, is having an event with Dr. Anana Mary, where they'll be discussing her new book, The Wandering Palestinian, which JVP-LA is also co-sponsoring. That is happening on May 4th. Check the link in the chat for more info, and may the 4th be with you. On May 15th, Nakba Day, people around the world will commemorate al-Nakba. We'll be hosting an event to honor survivors of the Nakba, and we'll be screening the incredible film 1948, Creation and Catastrophe, followed by a discussion with the filmmakers and other special guests. Please join us for that. The film lays the groundwork for anyone really wanting to understand the situation in Palestine today. The film will be available to screen at your home starting on Wednesday, May 12th, for those who can't make it on Saturday. That info is also in the chat. So it's really a good time to be in the movement for Palestinian human rights and for justice in Palestine. There have been some big student wins recently at UCLA, Pitzer, and Claremont College. Shout out to the students and faculty who worked hard for those wins. One of our own members, Dan Siegel, has been doing a fantastic job shepherding those students in the JVP groups there. Congratulations. Also, a little further away from home, SJP Butler, Students for Justice in Palestine, Butler, fought hard and had their Angela Davis event reinstated after it was canceled by the university. And a great event it was too, about joint struggle and collective liberation. The Palestinian short film, The Present, was nominated for an Oscar and it won the BAFTA. It's currently on Netflix. Please ask your friends and family to watch it. If you haven't seen it yourself, it's quite powerful. And that's not the only Palestinian film winning major awards this season. At the Venice Film Festival last year, 200 Meters won the Audience Award. That'll be releasing soon. Keep your eye on that. More good news, UNRWA recently started to receive funding from the Biden administration after it was canceled by the last administration. And whatever your thoughts are on UNRWA, they are a key target for the Zionists because they are the last witness of the Nakba. Even more good news, Minnesota Representative Extraordinaire Betty McCollum submitted to Congress a bill that will leverage the US's $3.8 billion a year in military aid to Israel based on if they continue to use our resources to arrest Palestinian children, to destroy Palestinian homes, to annex more Palestinian land, and to build more illegal colonies. It's a great resource. Please ask your local rep to sign onto the bill, HR 2590, info in the chat. More good news, the International Criminal Court has announced that they will finally investigate Israel for war crimes committed since 2014, when they bombarded the besieged Gaza Strip with what amounts to the equivalent firepower that was dropped on Nagasaki, which is almost double what was dropped on Hiroshima. That 2014 bombardment alone killed 550 innocent Palestinian children. Just a couple of days ago, on April 28th, Charlie Pillsbury from the Pillsbury family, as in the Pillsbury Doughboy, wrote an article in support of boycotting the company carrying his family's name because its parent company, General Mills, is benefiting from Israel's war crimes. More on the boycott, divest, and sanction movement later. And the latest news, Human Rights Watch has released its report on its years-long study that unequivocally recognizes that Israel is an apartheid state. It joins Israeli human rights group Tselem in calling out apartheid Israel for their human rights abuses and their crimes against humanity. It is a really good time to be in the movement, which is why I want to mention that JVP is having a member drive starting May 3rd to the 14th. But here, we are starting early. If you believe in the work that JVP does in the pursuit of Palestinian human rights, then please consider becoming a member or renewing your membership. Here in LA, all of the folks who join or renew between now and the 14th will be directly supporting the chapter. 70% of your dues will go to the work right here in our community. For the rest of you, please feel free to contact your local chapters, local chapter leaders. Feel free to add where you're from and your emails in the chat. And for those who also want to get actively involved, JVP-LA is always welcoming new energy and new ideas. If you are interested in joining an established working group or are interested in starting your own committee, we can help. Contact Dennis Courtoyer. His email is in the chat. Now, about today's event. It has been 73 years since al-Nakba. For those who don't know what the Nakba is, Nakba translates to catastrophe. In 1948, Jewish paramilitary gangs expelled over 750,000 Palestinians from their ancestral homes and villages, creating one of the largest refugee crises of our time. About 100,000 of those refugees, mostly from the northern villages, fled to Lebanon. Others found refuge in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and there are even refugee camps in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. In 1967, the Israelis, with the help of the United States' military might, created another round of Palestinian refugees. Many of them also ended up in Lebanon. Today, by UNRWA's records, there are over 500,000 Palestinian refugees just in Lebanon alone. Lebanon is home to 12 Palestinian refugee camps. Today, you will hear a Palestinian perspective that is rarely heard from. The North American Nakba Tour, in conjunction with the JVP-LA and all of the co-sponsors, present 4 outstanding young women coming to us live from Lebanon. They are 3rd and 4th generation Palestinian refugees. They and their families are stateless because the Israeli entity and the United States refused them their right to return to their homes and villages in Palestine. If you have any questions throughout the program, please type them in the chat and we will address as many as we can after the speakers share their stories. So, without further ado, it's my honor to introduce the 4 speakers. Our first speaker, Hanin Youssef, will speak to you about her grandparents' experience in 1948 and some of the history that led to the Nakba. Hanin's family is from al-Amaniya village near Safad. In 1948, they ended up in the Wawel refugee camp. Hanin has a Bachelor of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics from the American University of Beirut and a degree in chemistry from the Lebanese University. She has worked as a dietitian, a food quality control inspector, a field investigator for employment research, and an English teacher at UNRWA. Our second speaker, Hiba El-Ashkar, will speak to you about how even after the Zionist paramilitary gangs displaced the Palestinian population in 1948, they never stopped their efforts to eliminate the Palestinians wherever they went. Hiba's family is from Haifa and Nablus. She lives in Burj al-Barajni refugee camp. Hiba is pursuing her master's degree in instructional designing at the Lebanese University and had been an English teacher with Save the Children, a translator for media and educational organizations, and a curriculum developer, as well as a volunteer in community organizations such as the Palestinian Red Crescent. Our third speaker, Samir Mohammed, will speak to you about the social and economic situation that the 1948 Palestinian refugees face today. Summer's family is from the village of Libya near Tiberias. Her parents ended up in the Burj al-Shamali and El Jalil refugee camps. Summer majors in nursing at the AUB. She is a Palestinian diploma student at the Academy of Refugee Studies. She is a research assistant and has volunteered at AUB MC Hospital during the Beirut blast and the COVID-19 pandemic. Our fourth and final speaker, Ruba Abdel Jawad, will speak to you about what it is like being a Palestinian refugee from 1967. Ruba's family is from Lida and Gaza. In 1967, they ended up in Ain al-Halwa refugee camp. Ruba graduated from Beirut Arab University in civil and environmental engineering. She has been an engineer, designer, and estimator in Beirut and Kazakhstan. And she's also a private tutor in math, physics, biology, and chemistry. She is pursuing her next degree in social studies at the Lebanese University. I pass it now to Haneen to start the presentation. Haneen, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, JVP, for having us. Thanks, Samir, for introducing me and my colleagues. Well, hi all. I am Haneen Youssef, a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon. And you're here today what you have never heard before. So you had probably heard about the terms Canaan land, occupied land, Palestine, Palestine, Nakba, Naksa, refugees. Those terms you had probably heard about once in your lifetime or every time you check social media and the news. But what you have never heard is the story of each Palestinian that he or she has and still having. So today, me and my colleagues will be presenting stories of each one of us. Well, refugee or being refugee is the only thing that I inherited from my grandparents. Why? Because my grandfather himself was a refugee who was obliged to leave his home and come to Lebanon. How it all started? Well, simply it started with my grandfather. He was such a normal Palestinian living in his village called Al-Maniya in Safad, North Palestine. He was living with his family and siblings. They were farmers living in raising hens and cattle, planting seeds, selling such things to have their financial needs. Well, everything was normal, nothing disturbing it, rather than financial problems and daily struggles. But let us imagine together that we have a home, that we built it rock by rock and have a memory in each side of it. And suddenly a stranger come and ask you to leave. Otherwise, we'll be killed. Well, this is exactly what happened with my grandparents and every Palestinian family. In a stormy night in 1948, about March 1948, a group of Jewish soldiers came into my grandparents' house and asked them to get into one room. They asked men to take off their clothes and started criticizing women and threatening them. And they asked the men that if they didn't leave the home that time, they will rape the woman in front of their eyes. So my grandfather's dad asked his family to leave the house in accordance to avoid the consequences of not obeying the rules. So they left the house. They thought that they were the only family who had this struggle. But when they came out, they found out that the village is either killed or left their houses. The soldiers were threatening every family that if they didn't leave their homes and houses, they will be killed. So they had to move to a next by village into a relative's house to find shelter. They thought that it's about days and everything will get fixed and things will go back to normal. But things were getting worse, and the consequences led to many other problems. After 2 months, about May 1948, and after the Israeli declaration that's known to be Nakba Day, my grandparent dad decided to leave Palestine and to move to a nearby country. He chose that time Lebanon, so the destiny and the refugee were to Lebanon. The journey itself to Lebanon was not that easy. It was full of struggles and challenges. They had to take the street on their legs. They had to take their children on their backs, no food for days. They had to drink water from any source. They had to sleep in caves or even on the roadsides. The journey was really difficult and was full of struggles and challenges. All this took another shape and another form when refugee camps started to take place. People started to make their own tents on some cities or in some villages on a nearby or on the border side. So they started to make tents for them. But the tents also were not available or not good for living. It was about 4 meter squares where 10 to 15 people have to live there. Women and men in the same place. As I mentioned before, no food, no water. Some people lost one or more of their members because of cold, of malnutrition, or from starvation. Many problems they faced that time. And another problems was that a stormy night would ruin any tent in a few minutes. An owner, a village owner or a landowner may come and ask people to leave. So they had struggles that time. So the journey itself and being a refugee in Lebanon started and still a struggle till now. Well, I think most of you are asking how it all started, how we became refugees, who led to this. Well, the answer is simply Nakba, or what we know as Nakba Day. It is 15th of May of every year. We remember it every day, every year, and we celebrate it. So how it all started, the persecution of Jewish in Europe led them to believe that they were not safe in Europe. So they had to think about a new location to move there and find a new homeland. So Palestine was the destiny, and Palestine was the place where they wanted to move to. So the Jewish Zionist movement started by moving into groups, small groups. They started in small groups, moving and moving, step by step. And this was the first step, and it was not considerable. It was just a small movement. After the First World War took place, Britain promised Zionists that they will help them to make this homeland. So they started giving them homes, giving them lands, and helping them in occupying in Palestine. And after the First World War ended and the Ottoman Empire vanished, the Britain wanted to make its promise to Zionists and Jewish come true. So as I mentioned, they started giving them lands and homes. Here, Jewish or the Zionist movement wanted more, so they started forcing people to leave their homes, and kicking them out. And they asked them that if they didn't leave their houses, they will be killed. They used to collect 100 Palestinians and put them in front of the village or in front of the people and shoot them on the head. To show them that if they didn't obey the rule, this would happen to you. So here, Palestinians had to make something about it. It was injustice. It was not for their privilege. So they started to make movements and to struggle this movement of the Zionist movement. So they started to make the movements. This injustice was really clear, and British saw this, that it was injustice. So they started to take off their hands from the Zionists, and they asked them to do whatever they want. So the Zionists here got upset, and they wanted to make their own movement and their own land without the help of anyone. After Wa'ad Balfour, that was known, or the welfare declaration, Britain said that it will go out of Palestine, and the Zionists have to do whatever they want. Here, the Zionists have the military support, the financial support. They had support from the other countries, so they became strong. So in May 15, 1948, they declared the state of Israel, and this day became the day we all know as Nakba Day. Well, Nakba is not a day. Nakba is a nation story. The story of every and each Palestinian who witnesses and survived from Nakba. It was a life-changing that affected all and still affecting us, each one of us, depriving us of our rights and being an obstacle in every step we take. So here is my colleague Hiba will be sharing her story and her own struggle. Thank you.
My name is Hiba Al-Ash'ar. I'm a Palestinian refugee in Burj al-Baraj in a camp in Lebanon. And thank you, Hanim, for retelling us the story about Nakba, that it's very important to always remember. Now, I'll be taking everyone with me into a chronological trip about what happened to the refugees, to Palestinians after they were exiled from Palestine. Okay, first, I'm gonna start with the first 6 months after Nakba. The first 6 months after Nakba, Palestinians were not welcomed neither in Lebanon nor in Syria. So they were left and they were not welcome to re-enter Palestine and go back to their homes. So they stayed on the border between Palestine and Lebanon. And after 6 months, they were out of food and they were beginning to be very hungry and thirsty, and they were not living in a very decent places. And because they were not welcome to enter Lebanon, they tried to re-enter Palestine to go back to their homes that they were kicked out from. But Israeli occupation shot Palestinians on the border. So that was the first time they committed something against Palestinians when Palestinians were already kicked out of Palestine. Then moving on to the mid 60s, Palestinians were having enough from their state. They were hungry, they were homeless, they were stateless. They didn't feel safe, they didn't feel welcome. So they wanted to go back to their, and by that time in the mid 60s, they were already living in refugee camps, which is not the best place to live in. So they revolted through armed struggle to return to Palestine. They wanted to go back to their homeland. They wanted to return to what is theirs. But of course, that was not welcomed in a very great way. So in June 1973, as a result of the Palestinians revolting to go back to Palestine, they were welcomed with the idea that Israeli Air Forces bombed Nabati camp. Nabati camp is a refugee camp that was built first in the south. Palestinians lived there, and Israel bombed it because they didn't want any Palestinian by the border. They want them to be as far from Palestine as possible. So they bombed the Nabati camp, which is the first place, and it was by that time the safest place to be in. I'll be showing some pictures, and they might be a bit graphic. If anyone could be upset from graphic pictures, please turn your face. So these are pictures from after the Israeli forces bombed Nabati camp. You can see all the destruction. Okay. Now, moving on to June 1982, after the destruction of the Nabati camp, Palestinian people started to moving to Camp Ain al-Hilwa. By that time, Israel invaded South Lebanon. Israel invaded South Lebanon as in the target to target the PLO combat units. They were chasing them and probably wanted to capture them as well. So in that purpose, Israel invaded South Lebanon. And during the invasion, in return, Ain al-Hilwa was destroyed because the PLO combat units, the Palestinian Liberation Organization combat units, at that time hid at Ain al-Hilwa camp. But before the destruction of Ain al-Hilwa with a few days, they left Ain al-Hilwa camp to move to another place, and it was during the invasion it was destroyed. After its destruction, the women of Ain al-Hilwa were left by themselves, and they rebuilt Ain al-Hilwa from scratch to become to be rebuilt as a decent place for them to stay and be in somewhat in a good habitat. Now we'll be talking about a very important, all of these events are important, but one of the most important things, and that left people with a lot of scars, is what happened in 14th September 1982, which is Sabra and Shatila massacre. I'll be going through a timeline of what happened through before Sabra and Shatila and through Sabra and Shatila. First, there was an agreement between the Palestinian Liberation Organization combat units and the US government. This agreement stated that in return of these combat units leaving Beirut and Lebanon, the US government will guarantee that Palestinian refugees will stay safe and no one will harm them. In September 1982, the combat units left Beirut. They left Beirut and believing the words of the US government. The camps were defenseless. The camps were defenseless without the PLO, but unfortunately, the US government did not stay true to its words, and Israeli army surrounded Sabra and Shatila camp. It's a camp. Shatila is the main camp, and Sabra is like the surrounding of Shatila. It's all connected together. Israeli army surrounded Sabra and Shatila. The Israeli army allowed the Lebanese right-wing militias to enter the camp. Now, this was happening, the surrounding of Sabra and Shatila, the Lebanese right-wing entering the camp. This was all happening with the US government knowing that it was happening, but it turned a blind eye to all of what was going on, just in the purpose that they need to make the Palestinians vanish or to be in a worse state than they were. Now, for 3 consecutive days, the Lebanese right-wing militias committed unspeakable atrocities, raping, mutilating, and murdering as many as 3,500 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. Even though these unspeakable atrocities were done by the Lebanese right-wing militias, it was engineered by the Israeli army, and it was and the US government was watching all of this happening on the land, but it didn't do anything. And even though it didn't do more than it didn't do anything, it supported these militias by weapons, and it gave them weapons for them to be able to commit to have more resources for them to be more flexible, if you want to say, for what they want to do. Now for the last part of what was happening to be to summarize the last part, Israeli forces fired flares into the night sky to illuminate the darkness for the militias, allowed reinforcements. Now, these are the reinforcements that were sent by the US government to enter the area on the second day of the massacre, and provided bulldozers that were used to dispose of the bodies of many of the victims. Even though at night, where was the logical thing to do is to cease fire, the fire was not stopping, the crimes were not stopping, and the Israeli army fired flares into the night, so the militias would be able to see and to continue of what they were doing. After 3 days, the firing stopped and everything stopped, and women were taken out of this camp and men were taken by the militias. And after that, the bodies of these men were left inside the camp, killed and murdered. I'll be showing graphic pictures of the bodies and the destruction that was happening. If anyone gets upset by graphic scene, please turn away from the pictures. So for whoever is watching the pictures, these were the bodies of the men that were taken by the Lebanese right-wing militias. After that, after women returning to the camp, or what's left of the women returned to the camp, they witnessed these bodies. Okay, moving closer to our time, I'll be talking about 2011 in March. It was the Right to Return March that happened on 15th May in 2011. There was a big march that was agreed to happen in Syria, in Gaza, and Lebanon, on the borders of Palestine in Syria, Gaza, and Lebanon. And what happened was, it was one of the biggest. It had a huge number of people from all around of the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. I remember I was one of the people that went there, and I remember there were old women who held small packages of clothes and their belongings, and they were so sure that that was the day that they were going to return to Palestine. I remember as well that when we went to the buses, some of the buses were stopped before Naura. We were going to the Naura, and we weren't allowed to continue. The buses were not allowed to continue there. So we stepped out of the buses and we walked about a lot of miles. We walked to the Naura. When I reached there, as you can see, there are a lot of men. There's huge groups of men by the border of Palestine and Lebanon, and they went down in the hope that they want to break down this fence, and they wanted to enter Palestine. I remember a huge number of people were injured, and almost 18 Palestinian youth were are martyrs of that day. So even though the continuous trials of Israeli or any outside or anyone trying to make us forget Palestine, or there are numerous trials of us being non-existent, and as you can see, the chronological events that were going on and on and on about only with the purpose that they want to delete us from existence, we were not just giving up that simply. And aside from all of what was happening, the Lebanese law were not even giving us a break, which is something that my colleague Samar will be talking about right now. Samar, you can take the lead.
Thank you, Haneen. Thank you, Heba. Hi, everyone. So, have you ever asked yourself what does it mean to live as a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon? Well, let me tell you about this. Palestinian refugees are not allowed to practice more than 70 jobs in Lebanon. We are deprived of our political and civil rights. The Lebanese government treats us as foreigners instead of refugees. Regarding the law of work, the law is very vague and it depends on the Minister of Work. Like he has the right to decide what jobs we are allowed to practice and what is our job status. And unfortunately, it depends on his political affiliation, like whether his party support Palestinian cause or not. The average monthly income of Palestinian workers is below the minimum wage and represent only 80% of the Lebanese income. Half of Palestinian workers receive less than $300 per month. $300 per month is the average monthly income or personal expenses of a Lebanese lady in her 20s. So, can you imagine that a whole family is living for $300 only for the entire month? Work permits are not perceived as necessary in Lebanon, and like only 2% of Palestinian workers issued it. But unfortunately, in 2019, the new Minister of Work has decided to force us to issue the work permit. What does it mean to have a work permit in Lebanon for Palestinian refugees? Lebanese people and Palestinian refugees have the same education. So we have the same skills and we have the same qualification. So the Lebanese employer is not interested to pay for our work permit and to wait for ages to receive it. That's why they are decreasing our opportunities to be hired and increasing the financial burden on us. So, as a spontaneous human reaction for this unfair regulation, we went to the streets inside the camps and did an uprising against this regulation. What was interesting about this uprising that it was peaceful and it was inside the camps. And this peaceful uprising contradicts with the stereotype about us being violent, which is unfortunately adopted by the Lebanese media. For example, in 2017, a new Lebanese movie was issued. It's called Exiled 23. It talks about a public conflict between a Palestinian refugee and a Lebanese person. So as a support for Palestinian refugee, the Palestinian people went outside the camps and did violent protests inside Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon. I mean, we would never do such acts in any country or against any people except, of course, for Zionist people. Now, let me tell you about my story. I'm Samar Muhammad. I'm a daughter for two physicians. My father has studied medicine in Germany. He is an orthopedic physician. He has the chance to stay in Germany and to get the German citizenship. But he had the idea that we should stay in Lebanon until we return back to Palestine. So in 1980, he decided to return back to Palestine. He was not allowed to work in any governmental or private hospital. He was not allowed to open his own clinic. So he ended up working with the Palestinian Red Crescent Society with a monthly average of with a monthly salary of $1,000 only, while the average monthly income of a Lebanese physician is $3,500, which is the triple or more than the triple of my father's salary. Sometimes he does informally surgeries, but these surgeries are placed under another doctor name, and my father got paid for only 50% of the surgery fees. My mother is also a doctor. She works with UNRWA with a similar salary. I mean, my parents have studied for 12 years. just to end up with a monthly salary of $1,000 only, while they have 60 children to feed. All of their non-Palestinian colleagues ended up being university professors or head of hospital departments. But my parents' fault was that Israel has right to exist, and we have to suffer for no reason. My siblings and I got the scholarships, but we are not satisfied. We are not happy for this because my parents could easily afford teaching us at the best universities in the MENA region and even abroad if they were given the right to work. My only brother had studied mechanical engineering at the best university in the Middle East, but he spent 2 years unemployed after graduation. So he have realized that we have no place here in this country. He immigrated to Europe. So he left Lebanon and he left us. For me, I had the right to study medicine and I have the potentials to do so. But I did not want to experience the tragedy of my parents. I can't bear such life, like to study for years, for more than 10 years to end up with nothing. So I have decided to study nursing, knowing that Lebanon has shortage of nurses and we could easily find a job as a nurse. But I'm graduating in 1 month, knowing that Palestinian nurses are not allowed to work. So we are depending on UNRWA, Palestinian institutions, international NGOs, local businesses in camps in order to secure ourselves a job. Some Palestinians work with Lebanese institutions, but with no benefits, with lower salaries, and of course, risk for exploitation. Now, let's imagine together, with all these circumstances, can you imagine what does it mean to live in Lebanon? Like we have studied for many years. We have spent our whole life working hard to achieve our goals, but we ended up with unemployment, with underpaid, with racism, with the discrimination, with no rights for anything, whether civil or political rights. At the end of the day, we are human beings and we have mental health. They are ruining it. Many of us are suffering from depression and mental disorders. Some of us are at risk for drug dealing and abusing. And who is responsible for this? For me, the only responsible or the main responsible for this is Israel. Israel is our only enemy, and as long as it exists, our suffering won't stop. That's why we are fighting for our right to return, and there is no way possible to give up on this right. However, until then, we are urging the Lebanese government to treat us as human beings and to give us our human rights, because having them is not a privilege, it's a right, it's a must. And that's it. Ruba, the floor is yours.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Ruba. Thank you for hearing us today, and thanks to my colleagues Haneen, Samar, and Hiba, who presented to you a brief about the Nakba and the situation of the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon right after the expel and afterwards. And now I'm going to speak about the same issue as well, but for the 1967 refugees. So first, when we talk about refugees, many of you might think that Palestinians sought refuge to the Middle Eastern countries, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and same as some did to Gaza in 1948 only. But what you have to know is that another wave of displacement has occurred in 1967 too, for the already settled Palestinians in Gaza to the previously mentioned countries. And in turn, they are not considered Palestinian refugees as those of 1948. So herewith, I want to shed light on the situation of the 1967 displaced Palestinians in Lebanon, since I'm one of them, and we are facing much more challenges than the 1948 refugees do. So please give me the chance to talk about the residence permit, the accessibility to work, and the accessibility to the medical treatments in Lebanon. So First, refugees from 1948 in Lebanon fall under the UNRWA's mandate, unlike the 1967 displaced Palestinians. This means that the lastly mentioned do not have identity cards, and instead they are forced to issue a temporary residence permit from the Lebanese authorities, and of course it has conditions. Let me say that this residence is like a noose because it restricts the movement of whoever holding it. Staying in the country is for conditions, and leaving it is for conditions too. And by this, I mean the Lebanese law that states, staying outside Lebanon for 6 months, whether continuous or intermittent, cancels your residence permit. And this law is clearly written at the backside of the residence permit. And in turn, if you stay outside Lebanon for 6 months, you will no longer be able to return back to the country. One small story I want to add is about my father, who has spent his life working abroad to raise us here in Lebanon. Of course, because he can't work here legally, so it was a better idea for him to work abroad. And he used to come here once or twice a year, and every time, my mother used to issue for him a tourist visa because he doesn't hold a permanent residence. Until the very last try, which was before 3 years ago, when he left his job, and we kept trying on getting him a visa, and every time he kept on getting rejection, though everything was legal and fulfilling the conditions, to be clearly shown afterwards that the Lebanese General Security has issued a legislation that bans whoever holding a Palestinian Authority passport from entering Lebanon. Well, as for myself, the only way to attain a yearly residence permit is to be engaged in a learning institution. And by this, I mean that I have to submit a university affidavit, or else I have to apply for a short-term residence permit. And this short-term residence permit would be issued only for 3 months or 6, only in critical situations, like the need of travel. And of course, I should not neglect the fact that it's a very long process that might last in up to 3 months, and at the end, my request to attain this short-term residence might be rejected. Well, many of you, of course, might be wondering now and thinking, what if I weren't engaged in a learning institution? Well, the answer to this question is that there's no escape from applying to the short-term residence, unless I get married from a Lebanese citizen, which is choice A, and choice B, if I get to work with a company or an organization in Lebanon that is willing to take over the process of my work residence permit. Let's not take too long talking about the residence permit, and let me tell you another thing that you don't know about the Palestinians, or let me say the non-ID'd Palestinians in Lebanon, and which is the non-ID'd Palestinians differ from the 1948 ones, where the lastly mentioned are restricted to a number of professions, which they are prohibited from working in Lebanon, and it's around 72 professions. However, the firstly mentioned, we, the 1967 or the non-ID'd Palestinians, are prohibited from working totally, or else we have to issue a work residence, which means that we are restricted to work with a company or an organization because not all occupations are capable to support a work permit. Or else we have to work illegally with no benefits and very low salaries. As a live example, for myself, I hold a bachelor degree in engineering, and unfortunately, I can't practice my profession because at the first place of my nationality, which is I'm a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, in which I can't join the engineering syndicate. And at the second place, because I hold this temporary residence permit, which doesn't allow me to work. In addition to what I've mentioned is that we, the 1967 Palestinians in Lebanon, are not real beneficiaries from the UNRWA's medical insurance as the 1948 refugees do. So herewith, we seek medical treatments on our own expense, in which most of us are not capable to afford the high costs of treatment here in Lebanon. To come to an end, we, the Palestinians in Lebanon, whether 1948 or 1967 ones, are all on the same boat. That this boat will keep roaming until we get back to Palestine. Thank you for listening, and we are all ears to and ready to answer your questions.
Thanks to all four of you for sharing your stories. We'll get to questions in a moment. Just a quick reminder to join us on May 15th, Nakba Day, for our commemoration and film screening. One of the co-directors, Dr. Ahlam, is in attendance today, so we'll be happy to have her again back on May 15th. Now, I want to pass it over to Ben Kirsten for some action items.
Hi, everyone. I want to first thank our speakers for sharing these stories and experiences of the Nakba with us. Jewish Voice for Peace Los Angeles and our co-sponsors hope that these events are an opportunity to learn about the history of Palestine, to gather in solidarity, and also to mobilize to take action. Especially having just heard these stories, I'm excited to share with you the following actions, just a few of the many you can take to fight for Palestinian and collective liberation. As Karen stated in her land acknowledgement, we know that fighting for collective liberation means joining in struggles here at home. We stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is fighting to end police violence and affirm that Black lives matter. From the beginning, Black Lives Matter organizers have located their struggle in an international context, showing unequivocally how US militarism and US-funded occupation and imperialism worldwide contributes to the domination of Black people domestically. Black Lives Matter Los Angeles fights for transformative change and aims to hold police, our government, and corporations accountable for the violence they inflict. Currently, they are fighting to end police associations. Police associations function as organized crime, enable murderous cops, and bribe elected officials. They are not unions. And you will find information in the chat for a weekly gathering that is calling to say fund services and not police. We heard today about the history and experiences of the Nakba, and the Nakba continues. We're on the eve of a series of evictions taking place in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. The families there will be forcibly removed by armed Israeli authorities, just like their neighbors before them, and replaced with Israeli settlers. The story of Sheikh Jarrah and its residents is one of the Nakba and shows how ethnic cleansing continues into the present through a network of overt violence and discriminatory laws and policies. Please follow the links in chat to learn about Sheikh Jarrah and call for Israel's forced displacement of Palestinians from East Jerusalem to stop. We also heard today about the importance of the right of return. Return is fundamental to the safety and well-being of Palestinian refugees, as we just heard. And in addition, I would say it's a political and moral imperative. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a Palestinian-led movement organizing for Israel to comply with international law, including return. In their call, BDS calls for respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. By withdrawing support from Israel's apartheid regime, urging all entities to withdraw investments from the State of Israel and Israeli and international companies that sustain Israeli apartheid, and pressuring governments to fulfill their legal obligations to end Israeli apartheid, BDS represents a clear and sustained way to stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. And again, there are links in the chat to learn about BDS's action alerts and learn how to get involved where you are. Finally, we hope you will support the Nakba Tour so that our speakers and Nakba Tour can make an in-person make in-person events happen next year. The tour is not only an opportunity for women like Haneen, Hiba, Samar, and Ruba to share their experiences and for us to learn from voices on the ground, but it's also an opportunity for our speakers to make connections and pursue their goals. Please support Nakba Tour by donating at the link in the chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everybody. So let's get to some Q&A. If you have any questions for our 4 speakers, please type it in the chat, or if you want to speak, just directly to them, raise your hand. We'll get to you. I think there's a little emoji that you can click on there, and Ben or I will facilitate. So the first question we have from Brother Shaquille here in LA, American Muslims for Palestine. Brother Shaquille asks, for all 4 speakers, what keeps you going?
Samir, can you please repeat your question?
The question, Hiba, is, what keeps you going?
Okay.
How do you stay motivated?
I was speaking to myself. What keeps me going is the fact that as I grew up, or ever since I was little, where I was taught that Palestine is who I am. Actually, to tell you a funny story, it took me like until I finished my kindergarten years, I thought that I lived in Palestine. To tell you the truth, I thought that I lived in Palestine. But in 1st grade, that was my first shock that, no, you're not living in Palestine, you're living in a refugee camp, yay, whatever. So what keeps me going is, the question is why? Why was I exiled? Why am I not allowed to work? Why and why and why? So finding these answers to these questions is what keeps me going. And knowing the truth, it's not a very sweet truth. It's the truth. Nevertheless, it's the truth. This is what keeps me going. I want to reach to my, I don't want to say it's a dream. It's what's going to happen at the end, at some point. I want to get there. I want to get to the point where I want to see my land. I want to feel what I felt when I was in kindergarten, but truly in my true lands.
Thank you very much.
You,
Haneen, Samar?
Yeah. For me, the question is, why should I stop? Like our fight with Israel is on our existence, and I want to exist. And I believe that I have the right to exist, and my people in Palestine and all the Palestinians, people around the world, have the right to exist and have the right to live, not just to survive. That's why I find no reason to stop. All of my life, all the things in my life keeps me going.
Exactly.
We don't have the right to stop. We can't stop. We don't have the privilege to stop. We have to keep going. Yes, honey.
Well, the electricity went off, but I can share my answer. Well, as Summer said, it's we were taught that Palestine is our destination. So all we do is for Palestine. So whether we came early or after years, we are working for Palestine, for the return, for the right to return. So it is what supports us, what encourages us to continue and to represent Palestine in its best image, in its best form. So yes, that's what keeps us going on.
And for myself, what keeps me going is my ambitions, my aims to prove myself, to give an image of the successful Palestinian youth, and of course, our hope to return back to our homeland, to Palestine.
Thank you. Thank you. Amazing answers. Really, really moving for me. Question from Sherna Gluck. How do you feel, all 4 of you, about the focus on fighting for civil rights in Lebanon? Do you feel that this undermines the campaign for the right of return?
Okay, thank you, Samir. So our first step to fight for our right to return is to fight for our right as human beings. Our fighting for our civil and political rights It's because we want to be empowered. We want to have the circumstances that allows us to contribute to the Palestinian cause. Because currently we have no time. We left with no energy to contribute to the Palestinian cause. For example, some of our young generation, the new generation, don't know anything about the history of Palestine, because we don't have the environment to teach people about us, to teach people about the history, to give them the tools to fight. That's why, it's a tool. Fighting for our civil rights it's a tool, and it's the first step for our right to return. And if we were given our civil rights in Lebanon, that does not mean that we will stay in this country. No, that means that we will have the tools and we will be empowered to work, to contribute to the Palestinian cause.
Thank you, Samar. You talked about a very important point, which is that how the youth are forgetting, are not forgetting, I can't say forgetting, no one forgets. They kind of being more busy with the idea to have a work, to have a decent job, to pay, to get good money for their family, to get a better place than where they living. I think fighting for civil rights is part of our journey to return to Palestine. Like, while we are returning to Palestine, we can't just live in cages and be like, okay, so I won't live for the right for me. I won't work, and I am not gonna study, and I'm not gonna do anything. I'm just gonna work all the time for the right to return, which is the right thing to do, is to work for the right to return. But the question is, what can you do for the right to return? Which is fighting for our civil rights, and to have a decent job, and to prove everyone else that no, we're not just gonna sit down and be silenced and not gonna do anything about it. And Samar, if you remember, when they went and protests in 2019, when Palestinians were not allowed anymore to work unless they have a work permit, almost all the refugee camps went out to protest against this decision. So this was fighting for this civil right for these civil rights is part of our journey for the right to return.
Yes, true.
Yes,
Thank
for
you,
me, I
Hiba.
think these two work together. When we are defending our civil rights, we are in the same boat of defending our right to return. So they both work together, and this leads to this. So if we have the struggle and we have the courage to do one of them, then we have the courage to do the other.
Thank you, colleagues. Well, in my opinion, fighting for civil rights doesn't mean that we are giving up on the right to return. It means to have a better quality of living in Lebanon till we get back to our country. And let me say that human rights and values are indivisible, and we should not be oppressed nor suppressed, but fight for dignity, equality, and emancipation.
Thank you very much. So a follow-up for you, Ruba, is I have a question that came to me about the 1967 refugees. Someone asked, it wasn't clear what the circumstances were and where the refugees came from. Can you touch on that, please?
Yes, sure. Well, the 1967 refugees are really close to the 1948 ones. They came from the northern Palestine to Lebanon, but the difference is the different era or the different time interval where Palestinians sought refuge to Lebanon. The 1948 ones, of course, refuge to Lebanon right after the Nakba, which was in 1948. However, the 1967 ones, first they were displaced from their places, from their villages and the cities in Palestine to Gaza instead of being refuge to the Middle Eastern countries. But only 19 years later, and specifically in June 1967, A 6-day war has occurred between Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, in which only in a matter of 6 days, Israel won the war and it seized the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, and it also occupied the remaining territories of Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, the parts of Jerusalem. And here, Palestinians who already settled in Gaza from 1948 to 1967 were forced to fled again to the nearby countries, and that was called the Nakba. So that's the difference between the 1967 ones and the 1948 ones.
Thank you. Thanks. So I have another question here from Sharon McDowell. What is a good way to let others know about the situation?
If I may allow, I think social media plays a huge part right now. Our time right now is different from earlier. It's not just, it's more developed, it's more technological. So I think social media plays a huge part in this. And there's a lot of activists on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook that keeps the word going, keeps these stories being posted and reposted. So I think this plays a huge part, and learning more about the truth plays the biggest part of spreading the truth. So when you learn more about the truth and you educate more about the truth, you're just spreading it more and more.
Anyone else want to add anything?
It's about to spread the word. As Hiba mentioned, now it's easier through online or social media. So I think it's more about spreading the word online or in person to let people know more about the issue and how the situation is.
Thank you, Haba and Haneen. I think many people already know about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they know it from their point of view, from Israeli point of view. So our role is not only to educate about Palestinian cause, but also to prove that their point of view is fake. It's not true. That's why I think, like Haneen and Hiba said, we should use all the media, not only the social media, and use people's language, like use English or Spanish or I don't know which language, not only the Arabic language, because it's a tool to communicate with others.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'd also like to chime in on that by, what we can do here is simple phone calls to our representatives and our politicians, a simple email to them, letting them know where you stand, and try to push that arrow towards human rights. Bring a friend next time you come to one of these events. Bring 2 friends. Share people's work. Share movies like The Present. So same idea, just share and educate and talk to people. So anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask of our presenters? Here's something. Robert Schweitzer lives in Denmark. I want to know how to become more involved here. I so very much appreciate and am honored to have been able to witness and listen to each of these women, powerful and meaningful and passionate. Well, thank you, Robert, for coming all the way from Denmark to LA to witness this. So maybe any one of our speakers has an answer for him, how to get more involved in Denmark.
If he can specify more about the idea of involvement that he desires, to have a better answer.
Mm-hmm. Ben has a great idea. BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction is everywhere. Yeah, so I think that's your best bet, Mr. Schweitzer, is to check the boycott, divest, sanctions website.
Samir, if may allow, I would like to talk about something very important. It's always asked about what people can do for Palestinians or how they can support this cause. aside from BDS is very important to go through and to be dedicated to. I always support the idea that if anyone is able, they want to help and they really desire to help. I wish for people to focus on the idea of education, because as Summer mentioned before, a lot of Palestinian youth are not having the education experience that they deserve. So the idea to help is, in my opinion, to always focus on helping the Palestinian youth to have this experience in education. That would be a privilege. That would be a privilege for them, and for something they have the right to do.
All right, well, then I'm going to say thank you. Thanks to everyone for showing up. I know a lot of you came from far away. Dr. Ranu, I see you out there in London. Thanks for showing up. Thank you guys, everyone who came out and supported.
Thanks to everyone for hearing us. We are pleased to share with you our stories.
Thank you for having us today.
Thank you, everyone.